Hey guys, it's Selwen here. To continue with the Warlock, let's talk about the Destruction spec, with all of its new fantastic looking fire spells. Destruction is pretty much about those huge Chaos Bolt crits and management of your resource called Soul Shards. Soul Shards is what allows you to cast your main damaging ability, Chaos Bolt, on a pretty long cast or Rain of Fire in AoE. Mobility is typically poor in Destruction, with only teleports, Burning Rush, and a classic running at your disposal, which can make some fights frustrating and potentially preventing you to cast those delicious spells. In terms of utility, besides the obvious like summons and health stones, can be really good when you take in consideration all of your pet abilities, which we also gonna talk about later. But before we go deep into your gameplay, let's talk about talents. So on tier 1 we get Flash Over. Generally this is our go-to talent for everything, granting an extra charge on our conflict rate buff to decrease your next spell cast time by 30%. In a world where haste is scarce, this is practically a must. Eradication, it's alright, allowing your Chaos Bolt to add a debuff to the target, increasing all of your damage to that same target by 10% for 7 seconds. Haste does play a bit here, since you're gonna have this window to damage and cast a second Chaos Bolt to keep it up, so it's slightly harder to use but can be good for Havoc, a Burst Cleave, or for just more raw damage. As for Soulfire, isn't really that powerful. It helps with Soul Shard generation for sure if you need, but overall not that worth it. On second tier, Reverse Entropy is once again the go-to for everything. All of your damaging spells have a small chance to trigger a buff, increasing your haste by 15%, and needless to say, haste is a very important stat for you. As for the others, Internal Combustion isn't too bad. It's gonna allow your Chaos Bolt to consume a portion of your Immolate dots to deal damage, so it changes your rotation slightly by having you refresh Immolates more frequently. I just recommend going for Reverse Entropy instead, even though Internal Combustion does provide some extra burst, at least for a single target, or, the Havoc Cleave. Shadow Burn, it's interesting and it does feel a niche, basically a new ability that you can use to gain Soul Shard fragments on 2 charges, and its cooldown gets reset if the target dies within 5 seconds. So can work for dungeons, trash, or open world, but I recommend just going with Reverse Entropy anyway, more reliable and easier to use. Third tier is mostly optional. A Burning Rush tends to be the go-to for some extra mobility, although you have to be careful as it drains your HP, but remember that Dark Pact and Demon Skin has its use. Dark Pact for one is a pretty big shield, so allows you to soak up damage if need be on some tougher bosses. As for Demon Skin, it's just entirely passive to take less damage, so good when you don't need the other two. On the fourth tier we have Fire and Brimstone and Cataclysm. Cataclysm is essentially an AoE Immolate that also offers amazing initial burst damage, so it's gonna work great for dungeons, AoE, and even in single target. Fire and Brimstone in turn turns your Incinerates to cleave all targets, granting more Soul Shard fragments, so great for pure AoE fights. Now, when to use which will depend. Technically, you can just run with Cataclysm always. Works for every raid fight, works for dungeons as well, both trash and bosses. However, Fire and Brimstone is great for big trash packs, so in dungeons is really quite fun to use, but at the same time, you have phases where it isn't too much trash, or during bosses isn't really gonna work, it's practically useless. Well, not practically, it is useless. So Cataclysm can be better there. In the end, I'll leave that up to you. Choose what you prefer in dungeons, but for raids, unless it's a heavy sustained AoE fight, go for Cataclysm. As for Inferno, it's only good for pure AoE encounters, as it only benefits your Rain of Fire to give some Soul Shard fragments back on a 20% chance. Generally, you're never gonna take benefit of it all the time. For an example, in a dungeon, you can use Rain of Fire a lot, yes, but also you're gonna use Chaos Bolts on smaller packs, so the talent does loses some worth, so I recommend the other choices. And on the following tier is all optional again. You get Dark Fury to improve your Shadow Fury stun, a Demonic Circle to help with your mobility for a pretty nice teleport, or Mortal Coil, which has the least use but the fear can be used as an interrupt, plus the self-heal is pretty nice. On the tier 6 we have Grimoire of Supremacy. Once again, this tends to be the go-to for single target fights, or up to 3 targets due to Havoc, or basically raid fights where you see you can use your Chaos Bolt quite frequently with Summon Infernal. We will go over that more in a bit. As for Roaring Blaze, is simply a passive dot on your conflict rates. The damage is fine, it works perfectly fine actually, so in AoE fights or trash where you're not gonna use Summon Infernal can be good, but personally I prefer having Grimoire Supremacy all the time for really good burst and cooldown windows for boss fights or even tough trash packs. As for Grimoire of Sacrifice, never really that worth, but remember it's something that you can use when you want to get rid of your pet and just get its ability. And on the last tier, the go-to tends to be the Dark Soul Instability, a new CD to increase crit chance by 30%, so perfect to combo with your Infernal, especially with Grimoire of Supremacy, for even bigger Chaos Bolts, because remember, Chaos Bolts always crit, but its damage is increased by crits, meaning instability is just gonna boost Chaos Bolt to do some pretty huge numbers. As for Channel Demon Fire, it's more for AoE or cleave if targets are stacked, since its damage is increased when enemies are close together, and with Immolate active, so for dungeons this is gonna be best. However, for Tyrannical Week, it might be better option to go for Dark Soul anyway for that boss damage. As for Soul Conduit, it's just a passive to give some shards back, which is nice and works for everything. It's just a passive option when you use Chaos Bolts to potentially get 1 or 2 shards back, so it's easy to use but not the best. Now, before going into the actual rotation, what about your pets? When should you use them and what type? What specific one should you use? So for most raid encounters, if damage is your only concern, you should always go for the Imp. In fact, all of your pet DPS besides a Voidwalker is the same, so that doesn't really matter as much, but the Imp is ranged, so it reduces a lot of the hassle of having a pet, plus it grants a stamina buff with Blood Pack and a Dispel with Cinch Magic, which you can use on yourself or any other player, so remember that it exists. Alright, now for dungeons, you can run with an Imp as well, however you lack an interrupt, which is very much needed, so a Fell Hunter is pretty much your go-to for exactly that. He also has a Purge, which can be extremely valuable, so combine that in your bars like now and make good use out of it. Cannot stress that enough. As for the Succubus, is the least valuable for PvE. It does have a CC and a slow, so it does fill a niche if you need, but generally you're gonna be using the Fell Hunter or Imp in PvE content. That said, none of these pets actually AoE, so on trash packs, popping out your Voidwalker can be beneficial because he's the only pet that actually AoEs. Just remember to turn off his taunts, his aggro generators if active, and you're good to go. In the end, I still recommend Fell Hunter due to the interrupt and the Purge for dungeons. With that covered, let's go over your rotation, starting with a single target example with no CDs, then go over your opener and your AoE multi-target ideas. So the destruction gameplay is really quite simple, all about Chaos Bolts together with some management of your soul shards and your conflagrates. So soul shards are your resource as stated, having 5 of them, but contrary to demo or affliction here, you generate soul shard fragments, essentially pieces of a soul shard, meaning that 10 fragments equals 1 shard. So a conflagrate, which is your main means to get fragments, gives 5. Half of a shard. Incinerate gives 2 or 3 if it crits, and Immolate 1 per tick with an extra when it crits at a 50% chance. So your main goal is to use those abilities in order to fuel Chaos Bolts, which cost 2 soul shards. That being said, you always start with 3 soul shards, so let's just go over an example of a basic rotation here. Your main priority is Immolate, is a pretty powerful dot, plus is constantly giving you fragments as it ticks. Since you most likely have Cataclysm active, you're gonna use it here instead. The idea with Cataclysm in pure single target fights is that you want to use it on cooldown, and as a bonus, it will keep refreshing Immolate for more damage. So keep a lookout on its timers, don't be using Immolate to refresh a dot if Cataclysm is gonna be ready, so essentially replaces it. Speaking of refreshing dots, like Affliction, Immolate does benefit from the Pandemic effect, the hidden mechanic that around 30% of its total duration, so 5.4 seconds of the Immolate timer, you actually get a higher uptime on the dot. To put it simply, always try to refresh it when below 5.4 seconds. Getting a weak aura like this that you see here in the center of the screen that highlights it when it's the right time will help you by quite a lot. Check down in the description for exactly that. Now after this comes your second priority, which is Conflagrate at 2 charges. Conflagrate, like I said, is your biggest source of fragments, at least on demand, giving you 5, plus provides the Backdraft buff, reducing Incinerate or your case bolt cast time by 30%. All of this meaning that you want the conflict rate cooldown always ticking, since you have the 2 charges. So if you are there and not near the cap of shards, should rarely happen, use it no matter what. Only after this comes Chaos Bolt. Chaos Bolt, like I said, is by far your higher source of damage, so you also want to use it as often as you can. A simple rule to follow in this normal rotation scenario is as long as you add 2 shards plus, obviously, and the backdraft buff, use it. After that's done, just fill in with incinerates. That said, don't feel obligated to have a backdraft for every chaos bolt. If you high on shards, as it's the case of CD windows, feel free to use it without it. Now, to keep this up is relatively simple. You're gonna be at 1 shard or so, you can use your second conflict rate, but you don't need to. The CD is ticking, so you can keep on spamming incinerates, and once conflict rate gets near the 2 charges, use it. This will also kinda align with the required shards of Chaos Bolt, so is a good guideline to follow. Granted, boss mechanics and movement will change this up. So when that happens, just adapt to it. Just remember, only use conflict rate if 1, you're gonna get to the 2 charges, or 2, you're gonna feed a backdraft into a Chaos Bolt. As for the secondary charge, use as needed be, either for the Chaos Bolt when above 2 shards, like I said, or during movement, and never let those backdraft go to waste. However, remember you have 2, one is usually reserved for Chaos Bolt and the other for Incinerate, at least in this scenario. During Havoc or CDs, this can change. So let's go over your opener now. So when opening up is all about setting up a bigger Chaos Bolt, essentially with Infernal and Dark Soul and stability. Dark Soul just increases crits, so just more damage in general for Chaos Bolts, and Infernal deals a lot of damage around him, plus generates fragments every second. In addition, with Grimoire of Supremacy, each soul shard spent, so using Chaos Bolts, will increase Chaos Bolt damage as well. So you see where this is going, right? So when opening up, if you have the opportunity, you want to precast and incinerate as the pull timer is about to go down. If there's no timer, just skip this step. Then you want to set up your Immolate like before. Once again, due to Cataclysm, you're gonna use it instead. Once that's nicely set up, go for your Infernal. You always want to align your cooldowns, but remember, Infernal gets better with each subsequent Chaos Bolt due to the Supremacy talent, and it lasts for 30 seconds, while Dark Soul lasts for 20. So you want to delay Dark Soul for about 9 seconds, taking in mind the global cooldown, meaning that for now, you're gonna go for conflict rate. Once again, remember priorities, and then Chaos Bolt. The idea here is to cast as many Chaos Bolts as humanly possible, because you have this limited window to increase this damage. So if you can use one, use it. Also abuse those conflict rates, alright? Just take in mind you're getting a lot of shards, so don't overcap them with conflict rates, but that's far as management goes. Get them out of the way for more Chaos Bolts. Once those 9 seconds passes, you put your Dark Soul and just keep going for them really huge Chaos Bolts. And of course, once all of that goes down, keep with a normal rotation, Cataclysm on CD, managing conflict rates with the Chaos Bolts and the shards and etc. Now, to use those CDs mid-fight, you want to align them once again. That said, their timers are different. This is where boss fight times will come in, because if you know that the fight will last long enough for you to use a second Infernal, yes, do delay Dark Soul, but if not, do use it solo. The same follows if there's a possibility or not of a third Infernal. This will require some studying up and practice on your part on each boss fight. But yeah, that covers it. Now, before going into multi-target, we have Havoc to talk about, arguably the most amazing cleave ability in the game. So the idea with Havoc is that after you place it on a target, any spell you use on another target will be replicated, not only in damage, but in soul shard generation as well, like conflict rate. Instead of 5, it will be 10, so a full shard. The idea with Havoc is much like your CD windows, and of course will work amazingly with those same CDs. Fitting as many Chaos Bolts in this window will be your goal, so pretty much a single target. Just remember to pop it after Immolate or Cataclysm and before conflict rate for more charges. You can use this to cheese shards as well on any target that you can hit, even if they don't take damage. You will get some extra charges due to conflict rate, Immolate and Incinerate cleaves. Like it was with the alignment of Infernal and Dark Soul, you can also delay Havoc for the last 10 seconds of Infernal and Dark Soul to leave those huge kill spots. That said, on some fights might be more optimal to use it at the start if you want to get that damage out quick. Another thing to keep in mind is to always go into Havoc with as many shards as possible, so you can put out those kill spots quick. If you have Eradication, it will increase your damage further due to that debuff. Just remember when Havoc goes down to keep it up, so remember to time your kill spots right before Eradication actually drops. If you happen to drop it for any reason, it's best to only start your kill spots when at 4 shards, so make sure you will have enough to keep it up. Now in AoE, when should you start using Rain of Fire and stop kill spots? Well, Rain of Fire starts at 3 targets, so stop using kill spots then. However, Havoc with kill spots is still more powerful than Rain of Fire, so remember to switch that up and have shards to use during Havoc windows. Havoc only loses worth on 5 targets actually and above, so on trash packs do remember those rules, but overall is the same as single target. Cataclysm is gonna be really good here, and if you're using Channel, Demon Fire, it combos perfectly together, so keep that on cooldown as well. It does have a higher priority than Chaos Bolts or Rain of Fire, so as long as you won't overcap shards, do use it. But as for the rest, stay the same. When Cataclysm isn't up or you're not spec into it, you want to be multi-dotting with Immolates, alright? Just keep in mind the mob HP, if they are about to die or are short-lived ones, do skip out on it, but in a general sense, do keep Immolate up always. This caps out at 8 targets. As for CDs, like Infernal is extremely powerful, so make sure to use it on tougher trash packs in Mythic Plus. Just try to have it available for bosses if necessary. To wrap up, let's talk about traits and stats. So traits that can change up your gameplay, there aren't many currently, most are passive. There is one called Chaotic Inferno, which is a proc coming from your Kiss Pulse to grant an instant cast Incinerate, but in general isn't gonna change much. You can see on the screen what is the most powerful, and down in the description there's a link to a website where you can check all traits powers, since new ones might be added in the future. As for stats, Intellect tends to come out as a winner, but Haste is usually the follow-up as a secondary stat, and so is Mastery just for more overall damage. As for Haste, will allow for faster casts and lower conflict rates, which means faster soul shards. As for Crit, it's a very interesting stat because it does increase soul shard generation, but is kinda RNG, so Haste does beat it. But yeah, that covers it all. As always, thank you for watching, hope it helps, remember to like and subscribe to get more videos like this, and check out my Patreon if you wish to support the channel. Have a fantastic day everyone, and I'll see you all next time. See ya!